Hello, everybody, to this session where we each of us will give a short summary of what we said, or what I'll try to do. I will try to sort of not repeat what I said, but to give the main message, the main idea in this. I'll start by showing this slide, which you'll now have seen many times, about the nature of crisis and disasters. They're sudden, they're overwhelming, they're serious, they're swift, they're surprising. But I've underlined two of these factors or errors, namely overwhelming and surprising. And I've done that with the current crisis in mind, the COVID-19 pandemic, because if anything, this has been overwhelming in every possible sense of the word. And it's also been surprising. It's still very surprising. Latest we have the mutations, but I think it's a characteristic of crisis in general that there are surprises. They are not completely predictable. We're not really sure what is going to happen, and very often the surprises are such that we are overwhelmed by them, in the sense that it's not just a single thing, but things that happen will lead to other things, almost like an avalanche, or in technical terms, a nonlinear set of effects that develop out of something in ways that we never expected. And this is why it's so important to think about what you should do before you do it. We tend, when we are in difficult situations, to want to respond as quickly as possible, and it usually makes a lot of sense. But in crisis in particular, it's important to think before you act. And this is what this course basically has been about. It's about critical crisis thinking as a foundation for critical crisis management. And as you've heard in my presentations and in the other presentations, what characterizes crisis is we have limited time to think, we have limited time to analyze, we have incomplete information, sometimes incorrect information. We may not have the resources that we actually need, they're not at our disposal. And there can be certainly sudden changes in priorities also, that things we have planned to do will have to change, because the priorities, the importance of that changes, and of course there'll be conflicting priorities. So it comes back to the issue of management. And if you take a generic definition of management, which I've taken here, you can find that on the web in many different places. Management is a process of preparing, organizing, and controlling the resources of an organization or of a system to ensure that it can perform as required. And the last thing is important. The purpose of management is to make sure that whatever you're managing can perform as required, as it need to perform. And in order to manage that, in order to make sure that it performs as it should, you need to understand what's going on. And this is my basic message. And this is the rationale for the course. You need to understand what's happening. You cannot manage something that you don't understand when you don't understand how it works. That's why you need to think about it. And to come back to the idea of the systemic potentials, you need to understand what happens in order to know what to do and when to do it. When is particularly important, as we have seen in this recent crisis. Timing can be everything. So you need to understand what happens in order to be able to respond. You need to understand how something happens in order to know what to look for. What are the signs? What are the signals? What are the indicators? What are the trends that you should keep an eye on, to follow what's going on, to see how it develops? So understanding is necessary for monitoring. An understanding of how something happens is necessary in order to find out what are the relevant experiences that I have to learn from, both in the current crisis, but also going back, because we inevitably go back and look at prior crises, previous situations, something that's similar, that can help us getting a hold on it. And understanding what happens, of course, is necessary in order to be able to identify what you should look at. So it's a basis for learning. And finally, understanding what happens is necessary to to know what you should be concerned about, what you should keep in mind, what you should be looking out for, not looking out in the sense of how it happens now, but looking out for what could possibly happen in the future. In other words, for how to anticipate. So this is just to underline that understanding how it works is necessary for managing, and managing can be described, it's useful to describe it in terms of managing the four potentials. Now, something that I also mentioned and others have mentioned too, and I think it's fairly obvious in the current crisis, is that these things are not independent of each other. If you do something, it will have consequences in other areas, in other fields, sometimes in ways that we didn't expect. So it first of all means when you do something, you should think about and you should anticipate the consequences in various ways. But it also means that if you want to do something, if you want to manage and make a specific change, then you should think about whether you should do it directly at where you think the problem is, or maybe you should understand that there are other ways of doing it that are more indirect, that sort of it's a second order effect rather than the first order effect. So again, part of the understanding is understanding how things are related, how they are linked to each other. I haven't had time to go into that, but there are ways of doing that. And one of the ways I'm trying to show here and just briefly to say that we describe the potentials as functions, the function to monitor, the function to respond, the function to learn, the function to anticipate. And what this little diagram shows is how these functions are interrelated, how they depend on each other. And again, this understanding is important in order to be able to manage the crisis and to handle the crisis successfully. So sort of the main message is, what I try to say is, to manage a crisis, it's necessary to understand how one thing leads to and requires another. And critical crisis thinking is a prerequisite for critical crisis management. And with that, that was the end of my summary, and I hope you have enjoyed the course so far. Thank you very much.
Eric, there's a question is from Mark Jennings, is do crises by definition allow sufficient time to analyze and understand?
I would almost say by definition they don't allow sufficient time. What we try to do, and I think what Gary Klein has talked about, we try to recognize what the crisis is, because we try to find similarities with things that we have experienced before, and then we use that as a basis for deciding what to do. But there's never enough time, as we see that's in the definition of a crisis.
So I'm going to just think there's another question from Diana in Cambodia, who says, one question: how is it different from risk management? So how is crisis thinking different from risk management?
Well, risk management is looking specifically at what could go wrong and trying to assess the likelihood of what could go wrong and the impact, the consequences of that. I think we're not trying to look at what could go wrong. We're trying to manage something that is happening. And we try to look at the impact, but not only what could go wrong as consequence of what we do, we're actually trying to do something that will benefit the situation. So we're trying, if we're looking at it in terms of risk management, I would say we're looking at it in terms of opportunity management. We're trying to find out what should we do to make things better. So it's the exact opposite, but that's just a part of it. We need to understand the whole situation, including what would happen if we did so and so.
That's great. Anyone else want to comment? You can sort of go into Eric if anyone can comment. But I've got another question from Andrew Smagus. So this is a good one. How do we reconcile the need to anticipate the future with the recognition that the future is largely unknowable or unpredictable?
Oh, that's a philosophical. I think, well, it is incompletely knowable. It's partly predictable, and when we do what as best we can to make it more predictable. But I think we simply need to think about and be willing to entertain possibilities and not be biased in ahead of time and say, oh, this is not going to happen, this is so unlikely, and so on, which is what we very often see. So I think being able sort of to free yourself of your biases is an important part of anticipation.
The question is cuts to the heart, and in fact, it is the reality of this universe. It is the reality of the people participating who work in time-pressured, risky situations where performance matters. It is always what you asked. It's not a question, it's reality. And the things we're talking about, and what you'll see in my little piece about hedging your bets, right? The novelty inequality, all of these things are regularities about how adaptive systems, how the biological world copes with the fact that the future will change. We know for certain patterns about how things will develop, which is that they are uncertain. And biology is full of examples of how systems adapt to cope. If you look at we're commenting in advance of you watching the bet hedging summary, but I only summarize it for studies of human system performance, right? Related to naturalistic decision-making findings, which of course is, NDM stands for no decision-making, by the way. And understanding cognitive work in crises. But later this spring, I will do an integration synthesis on bet hedging from biological systems, how even in genetics is set up to hedge on the future, how plants hedge on very unexpected variability in the future, how people hedge on it, right? And this is the heart of what it means to take a resilience-oriented stance towards understanding and improving systems. It's about generating the adaptive capacity to handle the fact that shifts will occur. So watch in a few minutes about the findings on bet hedging.
Thanks.
Hello again, my name is Marcos Borges. I'm from the TECNU, the School of Engineering of the University of Navarra in Spain. Today I'm going to give you my final remarks on the Critical Crisis Thinking course. Professor David Wood, in his lecture on After the Shock, he talked about the before, after, and during the crisis. Today I'm going to focus and talk about the next, which is not necessarily the same as after. The issues, what we should do with the knowledge accumulated when dealing with the next big crisis. The critical crisis thinking will certainly help. Here it is important to separate between operational and strategical levels when it refers to the next crisis. Time is critical, and waiting for the development of a new strategy is not necessarily the best strategy. The front line should start responding as soon as possible with the existing mechanisms, but be prepared to adapt when actions are not resulting success or new knowledge indicates a change in the response process. Is something that we should continue doing. As one hospital director told me during the COVID-19, if you only knew what we know now, we could have saved lives and resources. But to wait for it would generate losses as well. Strategies are developed and improved with an open-minded attitude. While fed by relevant information from frontliners, it also needs to think out of the box. To understand the big picture without the interference of the operational heat. The characteristics of this process was extensively discussed in this series, and will not repeat them now. The only one characteristic I would like to emphasize is the collaboration among stakeholders. It's very important because we have seen too much battle of egos during this crisis. The lack of information to feed the knowledge development process and the critical crisis thinking was one that mostly called my attention during the COVID-19 crisis. The most repeated words in the media during the initial phase of the COVID-19 was, "We don't know." And this was not in response to questions on strategies, but apparently to simple information, such as the number of people tested, the number of people infected, the number of hospitalizations. The information exists, but it was not captured and processed on a regular basis. I think, again, that we're not prepared to process this information. Why did I mention next instead of after? I think this should be a permanent process, not the result, the after, of a crisis. Besides, even if it's not permanent, we should not wait for the crisis to end to start with the critical crisis thinking. Of course, any crisis generates a set of lessons to be learned and incorporated in the mindset, but only a permanent process of critical crisis thinking can make us better prepare for the unexpected. I hope the ongoing COVID-19 crisis reactivate this process, particularly translate it into more investment in research. I hope this course has established an important basis for further progress in your activities. The collective critical crisis thinking based on diversity constitutes, in my opinion, an important approach to deal with the uncertainty in the future facing challenges such as climate change, effects, or pandemics. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you next course. I'll be available for questions if you have some. Thank you.
Peter?
I just can see one question from the last one, but it will apply here. Is can you, Mark's answer this, can you give an example of a crisis managed well? Anyone can answer that. But Marcus, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't. I can't. Don't really can't. I saw mistakes in every management of the crisis. Of course, they correct over time, but I don't see any really a good example of a good management.
So this is the reason we study space shuttle mission control, because they were very effective and had many lessons about especially how the uncertainty was handled by integrating diverse perspectives, and those papers are out and been around for a while. The other place we're studying this, and I would say quasi-successfully or mostly kind of successfully, is in software, critical digital services, where we've been studying how they handle a variety of events that threaten outage or start to cause service outages, like Google had an outage in December. And so how they actually manage this has been a topic of study. A variety of things are available on how that works. And this is Eric's point of, this is what you need to study, that most of the time these things work and they don't count as real incidents because it didn't get severe enough, didn't threaten outage enough or cause enough harm to valued stakeholders. And so we're studying how they make it work, which of course reveals that this is more fragile than we would like. And often the sources that lead to resilient performance are quite different than everyone expected and modeled. So that is the major action of two colleagues of mine, John Allspaw and Richard Cook. And you can find their talks and examples of this and how it works. And my former student, Laura McGuire, and you can find all these at Adaptive Capacity Labs blog. It's one integrated place where you can find many of these talks in the software industry.
Thanks. David, do you want to? Who's going?
Jeffrey, yeah, but clearly the pandemic itself, we're in the middle of it, but some countries have handled it better than others. So there are examples of where people with the same set of circumstances, similar information, have just politically, economically handled the pandemic better than some Nordic countries, New Zealand, Australia, where I live, Taiwan, Vietnam, they've handled it better than other countries. So we have natural experiments going on all the time. Nobody's handled it perfectly, and there's lots of headwinds for everyone, but some people have done relatively better than others.
Well, I think that's a good point, and I would refer people to Richard Cook's talk, Bone is Resilience. It's a great piece, and it highlights one of the key findings about the adaptive world, which is, Richard would say, resilience is. There has to be aspects of effective adaptation and response to these events. It has to happen. It's guaranteed. It can't, if it complete collapse are rare, are very rare, right? So some parts of the world, some parts demonstrate adaptive capacity to adjust. In the pandemic, we have two major ones, which is the critical care world that has expanded its reach to handle, and despite being overloaded by all standards, they've been way beyond surge capacity and beyond the surge capacity, and yet still function. So there's been successes there in treating and saving lives. And the other one is in the virology and the ability to create vaccines, understand the virus, and respond with interventions. Now, that required, all of these required preparatory investments in adaptive capacity. And what we see in the places that failed was a long-standing record of eating all of the factors that would contribute to adaptive capacity, making these systems narrow, rigid, and brittle. And that's where you see why you see the UK and the US fail so badly, is because this never-ending extraction process of lean pressure that goes on forever ends up making the system very, very brittle.
Yeah, well, there are some cases, there are countries in Europe that we can mention that they start, at the beginning, they start managing very well, and then it was a big crisis afterwards. And that's the case, David is here, is the case of Portugal. Portugal was doing very well at the beginning, the management of crisis, and now is one of the worst countries in Europe. So something might happen during this period of management that affects the result.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Braithwaite, and this is my final contribution to the critical crisis thinking lectures that we've been developing in conjunction with ISQUA these last few months. So I'm going to summarize my two talks. I gave two talks. One was on rational decisions versus muddling through. And the second one was, what about returning to normal in a complex system? What might that mean? So let me talk a little bit for a few minutes and just summarize where I'm at and my contribution to this program. First one, muddling. You know, we base a lot of our work on this whole set of ideas about muddling through that Charles Lindblom developed years and years ago. And in fact, the next book in the Resilient Healthcare series that Eric and I, alongside Garth Hunt in Canada, are editing is actually on that title, Resilient Healthcare, Muddling Through with Purpose. Because that's what people do. They tend to muddle through with a purpose to try and get a crisis understood, tamed, worked on, and the conditions under which they are working eventually returning to whatever the new normal looks like. So muddling, although it doesn't sound very scientific, is us trying to understand how people behave on the ground before, during, and after a pandemic or a crisis. And many of us used the COVID-19 pandemic as our example. So that took us to, in my bit of the program, into resilience and complexity. So Eric's got the best handle on definitions of resilience, but essentially it's how a system adjusts, flexes, and sustains its operations in the light of disturbances, changes, opportunities, in order to keep on going. And resilient performance, which we published, we have published a lot of in our 6 resilient healthcare books, is about our capacity to respond, the ability to be adaptive. It's not so much toughing it out as making your way in the world during the crisis. It's about monitoring. Resilience is also built into the DNA of organizations, although it's true to say that some systems and organizations exhibit more of that than others. It's about doing workarounds and heuristics. You can't just take the policy or or the checklist off the shelf and deliver that. It's much more about improvisation, flexibility, and people's degrees of freedom and capacity to maneuver. The other thing is we made quite a lot of during this program is we are always sense making. Individuals are always trying to make sense of what's going on, and they're trying to be resilient in complex organizations. I also talked a little bit about and gave examples of the resilient assessment grid and assessment generally. How do you assess, take a sounding of where you are during a crisis? So again, borrowing on Eric's work, but there are other models. We can look at the ability to learn, the ability to respond, the ability to anticipate, and the ability to monitor during the crisis to see where people are up with and whether they're dealing with things well. So we gave an example. I drew this from Robin Clay Williams, one of my team, a very senior person who's done a lot of thinking about cases during pandemics where people operate. And this one in Melbourne in 2016 is an excellent case study. It's there was a thunderstorm and it induced a lot of pollen into the air and created a lot of asthma cases all of a sudden. So this is the mechanism, just for completeness, this slide, of the pollen transport getting sucked up into the clouds and then dumped back down and creating a huge thunderstorm asthma event. The red spike in November 26, 2016 is where all the cases suddenly descended on the hospitals in Melbourne. And this was unexpected, and people went through that as a genuine crisis. So you can use the resilience assessment grid, which we did, Robin and I, to look at anticipating. This was very hard to anticipate, although you always know a crisis is just around the corner. So a crisis of some sort is anticipatable, but this particular one is not. And so mobilizing quickly is important. And then monitoring the situation. What are the leading indicators? We immediately got those in Melbourne within a few hours of the event. And we could start to track the surge in demand for healthcare. Responding, how well did people respond? Not well at first, but then the take-up of response was really something that Melburnians could be proud of. And then learning from this is very important too, and sharing knowledge about what was learned. These are using the resilience assessment grid to look at this particular case, but of course, it's obvious you can look at it in any case. The other thing we're interested in is community responses more generally, and there's 3 attributes to a resilient system which influence how a community responds. One is the structure and function of the community. Is it sort of pretty much hanging together beforehand? Second one is self-organization. How do people deploy resources to deal with the crisis? And the third one is learning and adaptation. And that's very similar, this paper on returning to a new normal, to the resilience assessment grid. A couple of quotes to finish with. I like this one. During a pandemic, you should operate at the speed of relevance and not do irrelevant things. It's very easy to be busy and not productive during a crisis. Another one is plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Planning is a behavioral aspect of dealing with a crisis. Plans are just things you put on the wall or on the shelf. And in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity for Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher. Finally, often too, the end of the crisis is the start of a new set of challenges. So Peter, just to finish that off, I think the muddling idea is a very strong one. That's what people essentially are doing. A senior person in a health system that I know who runs an entire health system said, you know, they had all these policies about how to handle a pandemic. They had all these policies about how to handle a crisis. And they immediately went out the window on about day 2 of the crisis because they had to learn by doing. And I think that's very similar to what other people have said so far. So the idea that you're often trying to muddle through, but purposefully, and trying to learn on the run, on the hoof, is a very strong behavioural repertoire during a crisis.
Jeffrey, I've got a question, because I watch the politicians who are very muddled, and they simply say they are following the science. So that's what they say the whole time. We're just following the science. Now, as you know, some countries follow the science very rapidly, like New Zealand. They closed their borders and they had a very good public health response, and they don't have COVID now, and you can go to rugby matches. And give a country, you can say in USA or UK particularly, they haven't closed their borders today, a year later. Now, were the scientists in New Zealand not muddled, and the scientists in UK muddled, and the politicians as a result who were following the science were getting muddled information?
Thanks, Peter. That's a great question. And you know the answer as well as I do, because we've talked about this.
Yeah.
So the answer is some politicians just basically stuffed it up. They didn't really follow the science, and they didn't follow their own planning. Just very briefly, we published a paper a few months ago, the 40-country analysis of responses to COVID-19 in the ISQA journal, in fact, is International Journal for Quality in Healthcare. We looked at 40 countries and their responses to the pandemic, and we looked at three things. One, had they got good planning ahead of time? In other words, were they prepared for any kind of crisis comparative to other countries? Secondly, did they go to stringency fast? In other words, lockdown, wearing masks, social isolation, all the things that good public health people have known forever. And thirdly, did they go to testing fast? Did they induce a testing regime across the country? So anyone who needed a test or wanted a test or just thought they felt unwell could get one? That's broad-based testing. Or did they go to narrow testing where specific vulnerable groups, essential workers and people in aged care facilities essentially could get a test and were available, and testing was available? Which of those three were most important? Being ahead of the curve and already pre-planned for a pandemic, going to stringency early, or testing broad or narrow? And what we found across 40 systems, 40 countries, when we looked at it, was the most important thing was broad-based testing. And why is that important? Because that's a systems view and gives enough people in the community knowledge about their particular status for COVID-19. And if you have enough people who understand their status or can get access to a test to know their status, enough people in society, enough people in the system know what to do. And that was the telling factor in our study. And that's a real systems view of an entire country's response.
Our colleague Xuwen Chuang has been studying this in the context of mass casualty events in Taiwan and the response. And the important lesson too, when reviewers simply said, this is a long-winded way to say the way we respond is completely ad hoc. And more formally, it's the plans for emergency response are pure fiction. So if you look at this relative to the Science Foundation for Resilience, it says using the term muddling through is appropriate, yet has a big danger. And the danger is that we accept ad hoc, poorly prepared for, poor preparatory processes and poor investments, and that we simply rely on this basic finding Eric and I have had, and everybody engaged in this forever, which is systems are more brittle than stakeholders realize. Some people in an ad hoc way provide the essential source of resilient performance to fill the gaps, bridge those gaps, and handle the kinds of surprises and challenges that occur. That's why we study work as done to see these kinds of things. So if we focus too much on muddling through, we're giving a free pass to people who at the other levels of the system have failed completely to understand how their systems are not just brittle, excess brittleness in the wrong place, but are getting increasingly brittle as a effort that they invest in making it more brittle, right? They try to make it more brittle. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Yeah, there's a great question in the chat, but I wonder whether we should save that towards the end and get the others done, because if you could all read the one in the chat while we listen, because that's a great one to answer. So we'll come back to that. So next video.
Hi, I'm David Mendonça. I'm a professor in industrial and systems engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, in the United States. My talk was about measuring resilient performance, and I think, along with many of the other seminars given as part of this series, an overarching conclusion is that if we want to understand the response to crisis events and how to prepare for them, then we really need to address cognition from the individual all the way up to the organizational and even the societal level. I think in my talk, there were a couple of points that are worth emphasizing. The first one really is, again, we need to understand emergent behavior, and emergent means we're not ready for it. We don't anticipate it. It's a product of the system as it unfolds. However, we're often not in the right location with the right tools at the right time to get the data that we need in order to understand, capture data on emergent behavior. And I gave some examples of that from 9/11. Well, the last, I don't know, say 15 years in particular, we're now as a society in many places around the world awash in big data that are being produced as part of normal operations, but they're not produced with us in mind, the researchers. They're not produced with an eye towards understanding cognition. They're just produced in order to support normal operations. And so if we hope to leverage that data, then we're really going to need new methods that can help us bridge the gap from secondary data that are not produced with our goals in mind, but that are relevant to the phenomena that we're chasing, up to the theoretical level. And I talked about an approach to doing that, which involves measure development and sort of the marshaling of data from the wild, as Ed Hutchins likes to say, in order to address questions of broad theoretical interest. And again, this is where we, in my opinion, this is where we need to go. It's one thing to look at data that are event specific. What we'd really like to do is enable comparison with prior events, and of course exploration of the implications for the design of safer, more resilient systems in the future. And for that, we really need to engage at various levels, all the way from technology, but also up to theory. So we don't have automated methods for helping traverse this ladder from low-level data all the way up to theoretical constructs. We still are relying on human reasoning, insight, and creativity on the methodological side to make that happen. But I'm confident that as we continue to work in this area, we'll develop more robust, generalizable, and automatable efforts to do so. And I think this is going to represent really the opening up of an important new methodological area that will have implications for many other fields. So I look forward to the questions and to further discussion. And thank you again for attending the seminar and these follow-ups, and of course the series as a whole. And I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed.
I'll start with some questions that there are a number of them coming up in there. One is, so for everyone, most healthcare systems respond well to crisis demands that are normally short-lived or demanding. So like the 7/7 London bombings or run-in, but relatively narrow in terms of people and services, e.g. AIDS. COVID-19 seems to be testing our healthcare and public health system as it is both deep and long-running. Is this a crisis or a delivery system reconfiguration problem?
Well, I think my comment on that one is first a question, which is where are we going to draw the box and say, okay, this is the healthcare system and this is not. And just speaking about adaptation, where has the slack come from with this event? And at least in this country, the slack has not come from the traditional healthcare sectors. There's been a lot more staying at home, taking care of people at home on a really large scale. And so I think if we sort of shift the focus from an institutional one to a societal one, then the response to this particular event starts looking a lot different. So that's not really a direct answer to the question, but that's my answer to the question.
Anyone else wants to add?
Well, his question actually raises an important point for research to investigate, which is the finding, as we sometimes summarize it, is the places, as you just indicated, that have tangible experience with surprise are prepared, better prepared to handle new forms of surprise. And so the fact that emergency departments generally run near or beyond their nominal surge capacity means they have a lot of experience at adapting to handle overload of various types. They have lots of experience adapting space, resources, teamwork, roles and responsibilities to handle overload. So when you get a new form of or kind of overload or degree of overload, they have some ability to build on. As that happens, it stretches out to groups who haven't built adaptive capacity to handle surprise, and we start to see breakdowns. So the question, very interesting one. If we make systems too perfect and you have no ability, no experience with adapting to load and to stressors, right? Because one of the fundamental findings is adaptive systems are the rolled up history of their experience and expectation of stress. And so do you have to have stress in order to build adaptive capacity? Now that seems paradoxical in some ways because inducing stress would be deliberate harm. What? That doesn't make any sense. So this is a very important thing to understand in future work about this relationship that you bring up.
That's great.
It's true. Sorry, may I just add something? David's absolutely correct. That's a fantastic response, but that's a very acute perspective. What we forgot was there's a whole lot of people in healthcare who aren't in acute settings and who know an awful lot about the community, and we didn't harness that. So I'm talking about general practitioners, infectious diseases specialists, and public health professionals. And we just didn't harness those. They are not on the national committees as much as they should be, and in many countries. So I think there's a whole bunch of people who are close to communities, understand populations, who've got health professional roles, who we didn't harness as well as we should at the very start of the pandemic in many countries. And that means we didn't really capture people who knew stuff.
Hello, and welcome to the Critical Crisis Thinking course review from Module 3. My name is Eric Lofquist, and I'm a professor of organizational behavior and leadership at the BI Norwegian Business School in Bergen, Norway. The Bergen campus is primarily a teaching campus where I teach a course in health, safety, and environment to executive masters and bachelor students. These students are mostly top and middle managers active within Norwegian industry, and all are struggling with the effects of COVID-19 that has affected their lifestyles and organizations. In an earlier life, I was a senior military officer with 28 years of operational experience from U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, and I spent the last 5 years of my military career at the NATO Military International Staff as a strategic crisis management planning officer. The aim of the lecture for Module 3 was to give a short presentation of crisis management from a practical perspective and to introduce some tools useful to manage crisis. We then discussed how to build resilience into crisis response through concepts such as systems thinking. And finally, we addressed lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic using those tools. During Module 3, I introduced you to a generic crisis management model in 5 phases that I adapted from an earlier model by Ian Mitrov. Today, I will only discuss the actual crisis phase, phase 4 of the model. In Module 3, I also introduced you to a recent initiative by the Academy of Management entitled Managing Risk and Resilience in Crisis. The intention of this initiative was to focus on the threat of future global crises due to the increasing density of global networks of people. They asked the question, why do some organizations and societies adjust and even thrive under adversity while others fail? The conclusion was that we need to build organizational resilience at all levels within society. During the course, you have been exposed to the concept of resilience at many levels. Today, I will only address organizational resilience. Organizational resilience can be looked at from 3 levels. The first level is structural. What are the structural limits within and across borders that allow and inhibit behavior? These include things like infrastructure, rules of law, geography, etc. The second level is sociological and includes the concept of culture. We know that culture runs deep and is the invisible programming within the brain that affects behavior. The third level is psychological and addresses the mental models that help individuals interpret their surroundings and make choices. At the end of Module 3, I listed a set of lessons learned so far related to crisis management theories presented earlier in the course and the corona crisis. We discussed the worst case scenario and whether we could have foreseen the coming corona-19 threat. Many of the points addressed are very much related to the globalization concerns of the Academy of Management. Most significantly, the speed of viral spread. We also talked about the surprising lack of medical supplies and services that quickly overwhelmed many hospital systems. In particular, I mentioned the lack of face masks and hand sanitizers in Norway due to outsourcing these to China. It took many months to rebuild these capabilities. The lesson learned that has had the most impact on me is how the role of culture has affected both the spread and containment of the coronavirus. And this occurred both across cultures and within cultures. I ended the module with 3 questions related to what's next. How long will this last? Is a vaccine enough? And finally, what will be the new normal?
In my talk about crisis thinking, we focused on 3 perspectives. In particular, we talked a little bit about what goes on during possible shock events. We noted the novelty inequality, that the potential novelty that you would face during a challenging or deteriorating situation is much, much greater than what will be eventually determined after the event. That's a critical and fundamental aspect of the way these 3 perspectives align and misalign that we talked about previously. This time, I want to talk about that uncertainty. Right? During the situation, you have to act under this potential novelty, a variety of forms of uncertainty, lots of noise, as we've seen in the pandemic, the potential for changing tempos of activity and time pressure, and a wider range of threats. Are things going to be improving, or are they going to continue to deteriorate? You don't know until you act. And the resolution of uncertainty requires action in the face of that uncertainty. So what that means is, and has come out from research on naturalistic decision-making, cognitive systems, seeing cognitive work in action, and what goes on when we understand where resilient performance comes from, is you have to have tactics to hedge your bets. Right? Those are very simple, but puzzling. Hedge, but be decisive, seeming paradox. Right? Decisive, but synchronize across different roles. And be decisive, but remain ready to revise as change and new evidence comes in. Now, this is particularly difficult because remember, and no matter what course of action you go with, it can be wrong when looked at after the fact, as the novelty inequality highlights for you. Plus, this is all about time and change and dynamics. So under time pressure, you need to act, but acting early, it can be easily premature and miss things, where acting later, the situation continues to deteriorate and becomes more difficult to handle. So let's just briefly go through these different, 4 different tactics, right? Hedging is very simple. It means taking steps, but hold open, or value steps that hold open or create opportunities to change assessments, interactions, and courses of action. And that, as we've noted in resilience engineering, depends on anticipating potential bottlenecks, overloads, points of saturation ahead, so that you can build a readiness to respond before those new demands arise and challenge your ability to perform effectively, right? A simple example is early after recognizing an anomaly, your corrective steps should have some diagnostic value and remain easily modifiable, because you're pretty sure new information will arrive and your actions will produce more diagnostic information about what's really going on, which might not match your early findings. This is one of the first things I found in studying these forms of cognitive work 40 years ago, and looking at this in emergencies and control centers. The second one is decisiveness. You need to be able to take partial uncertain information, past lessons, and make a commitment to a course of action. This can be quite difficult under uncertainty. And you have to recruit others to support that course of action, right? But uncertainty tempers when and how to be decisive. So there's constraints on acting decisively that are particularly important in terms of managing side effects, given the interdependencies. And that means you have to coordinate, right? And your actions are really a commitment or moves in a multidimensional trade space. So these moves need to value responsiveness over the efficiency of resource utilization. And you have to build new forms of coordination, because the standard ways of interacting and operating are pretty much guaranteed to be too slow and stale given the pace of events. Right? Decisive actions are changing what's prioritized and what's sacrificed given the kinds of goal conflicts you face. The third one then becomes synchronization across roles and levels. No one role can do enough, right, under uncertainty and risk and noise by themselves to handle all of the reverberations that can potentially arise as the situation deteriorates. Roles need to be stood up, delegated, configured, set up to interact, all right, so that the team as a whole will not be overwhelmed as effects cascade and trouble worsens. So we have to amplify and synchronize these activities. That means reciprocity across roles is essential. Right? They have to adapt their roles in order to assist other roles in the expectation they will assist you should you be at risk of your response being saturated in the face of increasing demands. And then the fourth one is, whatever you do, the ultimate sense of hedging comes back to a readiness to revise, right? As you hedge, stay open and create opportunities and make commitments to a course of action and synchronize across roles, you still need to maintain a readiness to revise the assessments of relationships, actions, models, goals, and priorities, right? And so the commitments that you eventually have to do come with the risk of getting stuck and being unable to revise your assessments and replan as new events occur and changes build up. Right? You have to remain poised to adapt. Again, this finding was one of the first things we discovered back in the 1980s as we studied how teams of people responded in emergencies, and is documented in our anomaly response model. So, simple message to take away for crisis thinking. Hedge, but be decisive. Synchronize across roles and levels, but you have to remain ready to revise as change continues.
The hour, and there are a number of interesting questions that you all might want to do with is one that's been hanging around for a while, which is one of the factors, and I think that the last speakers are basically David you mentioned this. What are the factors to use to show if a crisis is well managed? They're synchronizing and hedging. Is that right?
I think the biggest point relative to the swath of things we've all covered is the extra emphasis on synchronizing over roles and levels. Muddling through, the positive aspect of muddling through has to have that issue of who and how do we connect and work together, in the expectation that different groups are going to be so caught up in what they have to accomplish with their role that others have to step in to help and assist, and extend their capability. And this issue has come up, and we trace it back in many of the things we've done over the years, that in the long run, viability of an organization in the face of these kinds of potential shocks requires extensibility, kind of analogous to the way software systems have to be built to be extensible. And this turns out to be a biological fundamental in all biological systems of all types at all scales. So hopefully those tactics can be instantiated in particular settings to guide people as they move forward from the course.
So there's a question there that I'm going to summarize briefly, just for Eric and for all of you. We spoke about moving from safety 1 to safety 2. Should we be moving to crisis thinking now in the new world that we're living in, rather than safety itself?
Well, I can just say that I think a lot of things have happened. We've learned a lot of things. And one of the areas that we need to look at maybe in relationship to resilience is crisis fatigue. In the early phases, we had a lot of countries were relatively well prepared, even though no one was completely prepared. And they took great steps to try to control the crisis. But unfortunately, over time, people got tired. And culture was a very strong factor, I think, on how people managed, both from a structural perspective, governments and people over time. So as we got tired, we changed the way we did a lot of the things that we did right in the beginning.
My colleague has been looking at this in certain areas up close. And his reflection on it is that most of these organizations' ability to adapt was extremely limited. Most of these jurisdictions, and you can reference my own state. And he describes it very simply as their ability to walk faster, not run, just walk faster, was limited. They could get a little bit faster, and that was about it. Their ability to change direction, they could do it a few degrees. When it demanded more, they could only move a few degrees. And when the world paused, they went, oh God, thanks. I don't have to keep trying to move and adjust. And I think this goes back to Jeffrey's point that community levels mattered tremendously. So in the US, all these community levels have been starved of resources for long periods of time. So their ability to be an effective partner in this, and you look at supposedly poorer nations who had effective local community health level things, in part because they were poorer in high-tech medicine, actually were able to do better. So this issue is the preparatory. Your system is set up in advance, and it can, and how agile, how much ability it has to move. And what the brittleness, the shock of the event revealed is most of these systems have very little ability to speed up or change direction.
Yeah, so I want to say that I want to thank all of you, our speakers today. This is quite a unique webinar that we're getting major thinkers coming together on one platform and discussing briefly, summarizing and going through the deep questions that face us today. And I wish that many other people who need to make these decisions will see this actual webinar, and I can think of a number of people I'd like to send it to. So I want to thank you all for a fantastic session.